In the world of extreme sports, they say the higher you go, the harder it hurts to fall. A truth Dan Osmond learned 1,000 feet above the rocky bottom of Yosemite Park, when one technical miscalculation turned a legend into an eternal lesson. For all its majestic beauty, the world of vertical rock lurks a ruthless truth. Rock climbing is the art of dancing on the edge, where every move can mean triumph or fall. In the late 1980s and 1990s, rock climbing was undergoing a revolution. The cult of extreme sports was taking over young minds, and the boundaries of what was possible were expanding with each new climb. Nowhere was this more evident than at Cave Rock, an ancient volcanic formation overhanging the crystal-clear waters of Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border. This natural cave, sacred to the local Washoe tribe, with its overhanging rock ledges and complex vertical walls, has become a major center of attraction and the most coveted destination for a new generation of rock climbers. In the days when the term extreme sport was just entering the mainstream, Cave Rock offered just that, extreme in its purest form. Of particular appeal were the 513 and 514 difficulty routes, categories accessible only to the most technical and daring. The granite walls overhanging the blue of Lake Tahoe at hundreds of feet were not forgiving of mistakes. A fall here meant serious injury or death. The merciless arithmetic of gravity was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in Yosemite Valley, 200 miles southwest of Tahoe, the vertical walls of El Capitan and Half Dome had long attracted the world's best climbers. But the real test was Leaning Tower, a sloping granite tower more than 1,000 feet high that seems to defy the laws of physics with its dangerous incline. In this place of pure risk, fate had prepared the final scene for one of the most daring climbers of the era. During these years, extreme culture shaped an entire generation. MTV broadcast commercials with stuntmen and skateboarders, magazines were full of pictures of fearless athletes, and tapes of extreme stunts were passed from hand to hand. The spirit of rebellion and adrenaline addiction defined the era long before social media made such feats commonplace. It was into this world, full of ups and downs, stepped a man whose name has become synonymous with unfathomable courage and tragic fate. A man who took rope, free-flying to previously unattainable heights, both in the literal sense, the height of the jumps, and in the development of the sport itself. This is the story of Dan Osmond, carpenter, father, innovator, and seeker of the limits of human possibility. Between triumph and tragedy is just one knot. One moment when 1,000 feet of freefall separates the genius of extreme sports from an encounter with eternity. Dan Osmond was born on February 11, 1963. A resident of South Lake Tahoe, he combined his work as a carpenter with an overwhelming passion for rock climbing. At age 14, he climbed Cave Rock for the first time, clinging to cracks while others played soccer. His life was characterized by remarkable simplicity. A modest apartment, minimal belongings, only the most essential gear. He called himself a slow learner, recalling how he labored for 8 years to reach the expert level. Every day he came to Cave Rock above the shining surface of Lake Tahoe, spending hours honing his skills on the same routes, memorizing every ledge and crack. Osmond's routine was simple. A few months of construction work, then weeks on the rocks. On the construction site I made a living, on the rocks I lived, he told friends. Friends joked that he slept with a carbine under his pillow. The turning point came in the mid-'80s, when Dan met Dave Griffith at Joshua Tree National Park. On a day when Griffith was struggling with an acid crack route, Osmond went after him, showing off a couple moves that surprised his older comrade. He had the perfect physique for a climber, Griffith later recalled. Light but strong, with a great strength-to-weight ratio. More important, however, was his mental toughness, his ability to focus in a moment of extreme exertion. By the late 80s, Dan Osmond began experimenting with solo ascents without insurance. The Atlantis route in Sequoia National Park became one of his landmark solos, a technically difficult route where the slightest mistake could mean death. Osmond, however, had his own take on fear and risk. Solo is just a game, a serious game, but a game. The price of a mistake is your life, so you'd better know exactly what you're doing, he told a friend, and these words became a manifesto of his life philosophy. Behind Osmond's reserved character and modesty was depth and complexity. While he did not compete and rarely sought public speaking, he was focused on the inner challenge of overcoming his own limits, rather than defeating others. This quality gave his figure a special significance in a community where ego was often more important than true achievement. By the early 90s, Dan Osmond had transformed himself from an unknown climber into a local legend, a man who not only conquered the rocks, but understood their language, their secret script, engraved by millions of years of erosion and geologic change. In 1980, while climbing a new route on cave rock, which he later named Phantom Lord, Dan Osmond experienced something that changed his perception of the extreme. While working over an overhanging ledge, he repeatedly fell off, dropping with a rope to a considerable height. These falls, whippers, as climbers call them, were frightening at first, but soon an amazing thing happened. Fear was replaced by excitement. At some point I realized that falling was a bigger challenge for me than the climbing itself, he later admitted in an interview with Rock and Ice. So, after coming face to face with his own fear of falling and learning to control that fear, Osmond suddenly discovered a new realm of extreme climbing, the world of controlled freefall. By 1991, Dan was already experimenting with what would later be called rope-free flying, jumping with a rope with minimal stretch, providing a much longer free fall than in bungee jumping. His system was radically different from bungee jumping. Instead of an elastic cord, he used a dynamic nylon rope with a diameter of 10 or 11 millimeter, which stopped the fall abruptly, but not far from the ground. The story might have unfolded differently had it not been for a chance encounter at Cave Rock in the summer of 1991. Eric Perlman and Mike Hatchett, filmmakers making a documentary about rock climbing, noticed a lone figure climbing a 5.14 difficulty route, a rating available only to elite world-class climbers. Perlman sensed it immediately. The camera loves this man. One of the aspects that everyone knows but rarely articulates is that Dan was a brilliant performer. The camera loved him for his line and fluidity of movement, Perlman later recalled. So, Osmond became the star of the first Masters of Stone movie, which captured not only his climbing, but also his early experiments with jumping. The movie brought him fame far beyond his local community, and soon MTV was airing commercials featuring his falls, reaching an audience of millions. As his fame grew, so did the scale of his jumps. From an initial 300 feet, Osmond went to 600, then 800, installing increasingly complex systems. His engineering thinking manifested itself in inventive configurations of ropes, pulleys, and anchor points that experienced climbers called works of art. Unlike bungee jumpers working with commercial platforms, Osmond installed his systems in the most inaccessible places, on cliffs, bridges, and the arches of Utah's canyons. In doing so, he deliberately avoided duplicate belay systems, relying on a single rope and his own calculations, an approach that has drawn both admiration and criticism. The transition from rock climbing to rope-free flying wasn't just a change of discipline for Osmond. It was a logical extension of his inner journey, a constant search for new facets of extreme sports. I'm genuinely scared. I'm doing this to learn how to overcome fear, to swim in it and go beyond it. These words reveal the true motivation of a man for whom risk was not just an adrenaline rush, but a profound experience of self-discovery. Behind the dizzying jumps and growing fame was another side of Dan Osmond's life. In the late 80s, he married, though the union was short-lived. His obsession with rock and increasingly risky projects ruined the marriage. Out of that brief union, however, came the most precious thing in his life, his daughter Emma. By the early 90s, when Dan had already separated from his wife, little Emma was living with her mother. He saw his daughter when he returned to Tahoe between trips, but the meetings were sporadic. The schedule of an itinerant rock climber rarely combined with the measured life of a child. By dying, I'll let everyone down. My family, my friends. Emma will do fine. She'll be fine. But I'll deprive her of her father, Osmond confided to those close to him. You could hear the anxiety in his voice, but also the fatalism, as if he had already accepted the inevitability of choosing between passion and duty. When I jump, I feel more alive than ever, he said in an interview. But then I get home and I see Emma, and I realize I need to live to see her graduation, her wedding. By 1998, as Dan Osmond's name became legendary, and his jumps reached unprecedented heights, an internal conflict reached a tipping point. The paradox of his life was that his search for freedom through falling only kept him more firmly anchored to the ground, to his daughter, to his responsibilities, to the idea that his obsession had an exorbitant price. And the pendulum of his life continued to swing between safety and risk, between fatherhood and passion for flight, carrying him farther and farther to new heights, where the air grew thinner and the margin of safety thinner. Growing fame comes with a price. By the mid-1990s, after the release of several Masters of Stone movies featuring him, Dan Osmond's name was provoking polar reactions in the extreme sports community. To some, he was an icon, a rock climber pushing the boundaries of what was possible. To others, a reckless showman putting spectacle before safety. Dan did things we only dreamed of, recalled a young Alex Honnold, who watched tapes of his climbs in Sacramento as a child. At the same time, an older generation of climbers shook their heads. He's taking it too far. It's not climbing anymore, it's a circus. His jumps were of particular concern to national park rangers. After Osmond performed a series of impressive jumps from the Forest Hill Bridge more than 400 feet high in California, local authorities stepped up patrols of the site. He's setting a dangerous example, one spokesperson said when video of the jump hit the local news. Amateurs without his training will try to replicate it and die. Osmond's technically complex systems were admired by engineers. He calculated fall trajectories to within a few feet, using knowledge of physics and material properties gained through experience. But critics pointed to the most important thing: the lack of a redundant safety system. In the world of industrial climbing and even commercial bungee, this would be unthinkable. In traditional rock climbing, you have buddies, belays, hooks, a whole system. Dan had one rope and absolute faith in his calculations, commented Dave Griffith. That faith bordered on self-confidence, but it was the essence of his philosophy of risk. In April 1997, after a particularly dangerous arch jump in the Utah canyons, Osmond gave an interview to Outside Magazine in which he expressed his attitude to fear. "I'm really scared every time. Only fools or liars aren't scared. But I go into it precisely because of fear, to learn to live with it, to bathe in it, and go beyond it. When you really look fear in the eye, you begin to understand something about yourself and about life that you can't understand otherwise." By 1998, the external conflicts had only intensified. Yosemite, the holy of holies of American rock climbing, became Osmond's next target. The national park, with its strict rules and vigilant rangers, presented a double challenge, both as a landscape for record-breaking jumps and as an area where his activities were in a gray area of legality. For Dan, this was a new frontier, the last and most significant. October 1998. Yosemite Valley, protected by granite walls and thousand-year-old pines, looked especially impressive in the fall light. Here, between the legendary Leaning Tower Cliff and the little-known Fifi Buttress Cliff, Dan Osmond and his team were installing a system that would change the perception of what was possible in rope-free flying. A 200-foot-long horizontal line between 2 points allowed for a record-breaking jump of more than 1,000 feet of free fall. Installation took weeks. Every component of the system, from attachment points to nodes, was tested multiple times. Dan worked with precision accuracy, knowing that even millimeters can make a difference at this scale. Among his temporary jump partners was Dean Potter, a rising climbing star who would later set speed climbing records on El Capitan. Despite his own courage, Potter admitted that Osmond's jumps made him uncomfortable. "My climbing has always been about control, so throwing myself off cliffs thinking I might survive, I might die, made me a bit tense." On October 17, in the midst of preparing for the record-breaking jump, Dan's phone rang. It was his daughter, Emma, her voice shaking with tears. "Daddy, I'm scared for you," she said. Without a second's hesitation, Osmond put down his gear and got into the car. "This is more important," he said briefly to his surprised comrades. The rock could wait. His daughter could not. 2 days later, returning to Yosemite from a trip to see his family, Osmond faced an unforeseen twist of fate. He was arrested by rangers for unpaid parking tickets and other minor infractions. A situation that could have been resolved with a simple payment suddenly escalated. Dan was placed in solitary confinement for 12 days. The harsh confinement for a parking violator seemed excessive. Osmond's friends whispered about a demonstration lesson, a way for rangers to dissuade him from jumping in a national park. Either way, for a man accustomed to the freedom of the cliffs and open sky, the cell walls were an ordeal more severe than any physical challenge. 12 days later, when friends raised $25,000 bail, Dan was released. Eric Perlman, the Masters of Stone director who offered his house as collateral, met him in Reno. He was depressed after all that time alone, Perlman later recalled, watching Dan Osmond spend time with his daughter, trying to be a normal father despite the inner turmoil. During those November days in 1998, those close to him saw a change in Dan. He spoke of the last big jump, and that, "It's time to live a quieter life." In a rare interview, he admitted, "When this is all over, I'm looking forward to time with my daughter and family, and basically just laying on the couch for a while. I've been rushing around at cosmic speed for a long time, and I think everything has its time before it starts to catch up with you. I have this charismatic group of guardian angels who need a paid vacation." No one could have predicted that those words would prove prophetic, and that the guardian angels were indeed tired. "Two flat tires. Need to get back to the system in Yosemite to dismantle it," was the explanation Dan Osmond gave to his friend Miles Dasher, asking for a ride late in the evening of November 20th, 1998. After bail and a few days with his family in Reno, Osmond seemed resigned to the fact that his ambitious project would have to be scrapped. But something in his eyes said otherwise. They arrived in Yosemite on November 21 and climbed Leaning Tower that same evening. Osmond knew every stone of the route, even in the dark. The line between the tower and Fifi Buttress, strung a month ago, was still in place despite the rains and November snow. The system survived the weather, but the 925-foot rope he jumped from in October was inevitably exposed to the elements. On the morning of November 22, rather than begin dismantling, Osmond suggested, "Let's test the system first. I'll make the jump and then you." Miles, who trusted Dan's experience, agreed. The jumps were successful, and they spent the evening restocking the village store, talking about tomorrow, but never a word about dismantling the system. On November 23, 1998, at 4:15 p.m., Miles completed his jump and rappelled down the rope stored in his belt pouch. When he returned to the tower around 5:30 p.m., he found Osmond feverishly preparing for another jump. The sun was already slipping toward the horizon, plunging the valley into twilight. "I'll be jumping from a 1,000-foot line, which means I'll only be 150 feet off the ground when I stop," Osmond explained, adding an extra 75 feet of rope, which is 3 times the usual amount. He also changed the angle of the jump, requiring him to jump over the recovery line. Already in the encroaching darkness, he pulled out his phone to notify his friends of the upcoming record-breaking jump. Slipping the phone into the case on his chest, he prepared for the jump. The wind picked up. The cold air filled with anticipation. Looking back, Dasher saw the warning signs. The rush because of the darkness, the significant increase in rope, the change in angle, Osmond's confidence bordering on fear. But in that moment, faith in Dan's exceptional skill outweighed doubt. "It's not just about the ropes," Osmond said quietly before the jump, looking at the valley below. "It's about facing your fear. Falling is the most honest form of prayer." Dasher watched the flashlight on Dan's helmet disappear into the darkness. He heard the sound of a tightening rope beginning to whip, and then the sudden cessation of that sound. Osmond's shout. Then a heavy thump. In a panicked state, Dasher tried to reach him by radio, but there was no answer. As the silence dragged on, the worst fears turned into an unbearable certainty. Miles Dasher's heart was pounding like crazy as he made his way downstairs in the dark. Every second seemed like an eternity. When he reached the base, he turned on his headlamp and began to make his way across the rocky field, directing the beam of light between boulders and trees. At 1840, Dasher spotted a scrap of rope dangling from a branch high above the ground. Tracing his gaze downward, he saw Osmond lying on his side. In a last ray of hope, Dasher ran up and checked for a pulse. There was no pulse. Dan looked almost serene, as if he'd fallen asleep. No visible injuries, no grimace of pain, just the perfect peace of a man who was no longer fighting the Earth's gravity. At the age of 35, Dan Osmond made his last flight. Dasher, shaken to the core, rushed across the boulders to the nearest parking lot, where he struggled to dial his friend's number on a payphone. "Dan's dead," he said, sobbing. "He's on the ground. I just saw him. He's dead." A call to 911 followed. An hour later, the coroner arrived with park rangers who attempted to reach the scene, but turned back because of slippery conditions. The overnight rain had turned rocks into death traps. They contacted Dean Potter, then a member of YOSEMITE Search and Rescue, and asked him to find the body. Potter arrived late in the afternoon and spent the night next to his friend's body, guarding it from wild animals. In a strange irony of fate, Potter, who had been uncomfortable with Osmond's jumps, now found himself the final guardian of his rest, unaware that 17 years later he himself would die in a base jumping accident not far from here, from Taft Point in Yosemite. The next day, while inspecting the ropes, Potter and technical experts discovered a clue to the tragedy. Dan Osmond hadn't realized that changing the angle of the jump would put an excessive load on one of the knots connecting sections of his rope. That load, about 10-12 kilonewtons, equivalent to 2,700 pounds, exceeded the strength of the connection, causing the knot to slip. The technical miscalculation, compounded by a month of exposure to rain and snow on the gear, was fatal to a man who always claimed, "My life depends on the rope, so I know the rope better than anyone else." In a tragic irony, his last words to Dasher, all set," turned out to be the biggest mistake he ever made. The man who taught others to bathe in fear may not have experienced enough fear in that moment to stop. The imperceptible line between courage and recklessness, like the line between life and death, was crossed in the twilight November sky of Yosemite when the rope, instead of being a bridge between falling and flying, became a broken thread of fate. For 3 weeks after the tragedy, Osmond's system still hung between Leaning Tower and Fifi Buttress, including much of the broken jump line. Park rangers conducted an investigation that progressed more slowly than Dan's friends had anticipated. In December 1998, a rescue team retrieved the top sections of the jump line and sent them for examination. A company that makes world-class climbing equipment conducted a thorough analysis. The results were unequivocal. Osmond did not foresee that the change in jump angle would put undue stress on one of the knots. No deliberate sabotage was found. Rumors that the rangers may have damaged the rope as a lesson circulated in the climbing community, but laboratory analysis disproved this theory. The ropes were not significantly damaged by exposure to sun and rain in 3 weeks. Technically, the conclusion was simple. A key knot had slipped, not broken. On November 28, 1998, on a cold, windy day, more than 200 friends and family members gathered at Cave Rock above Lake Tahoe to pay their respects to Dan Osmond. His ashes were scattered over the waters of the lake he loved so much and where he spent the best years of his life. 8-year-old Emma, standing next to her mother, watched her father's ashes being carried away by the wind. Eric Perlman, Dave Griffith, Miles Dasher, and other close friends spoke words of farewell, of his courage, his talent, his humanity beyond the rocks and cameras. That same day, Osmond's friends announced a memorial fund for Emma. Recognizing that her father, despite his growing fame, had lived modestly and left no significant savings, the community decided to secure her future. The funds were earmarked for the education of a girl raised on stories of a dad who could fly. Dean Potter, who guarded Osmond's body the night after the tragedy, later said, "Dan lived life the way he thought was right, fully, intensely, accepting risk as part of the journey. We can argue about his choices, but not about his sincerity in following his vision." In Yosemite, where the final scene of his life played out, the memory of the man who danced with the abysses lingers among rangers and climbers. The park that arrested him became the site of his legend, a contradiction that Osmond would probably appreciate. Dan Osmond's death divided the world of extreme sports. Critics accused him of recklessness and irresponsibility to his daughter. Those who knew him personally saw a brave man who consciously faced his fears. He was not a madman risking his life for adrenaline, Eric Perlman noted in Outside Magazine. He was an explorer, an artist working in the medium of fear and gravity. What to others seemed reckless, to him was a deeply realized process. In 2007, the U.S. Forest Service permanently closed Cave Rock to rock climbing. There was something symbolic about the fact that the place Osmond transformed from a cluttered site to an iconic space for climbers remained his domain, untouched by new generations. Alex Honnold, who became famous for solo climbing El Capitan, recognized Osmond's influence. Dan Osmond did things on Cave Rock that, to me as a kid, represented the only sport routes I knew anything about. It was inspiring. Osmond's legacy in rope-free flying is more complex. His minimalist approach to safety didn't become mainstream. The cost of making a mistake was too high. But his philosophical attitude to fear has influenced modern aerial extreme sports. Dan Osmond's story reminds us that there is a fine line between triumph and tragedy. Extreme sports test the limits of human capabilities, but the dangers involved should never be underestimated. Perhaps Dan Osmond's greatest lesson is the importance of balance, between passion and responsibility, between innovation and preparation, between freedom and caring for those who love us. As he himself said in his latest interview, "When this is all over, I really look forward to spending time with my daughter and family." For those who turn to the vertical worlds in search of themselves, his story serves as both inspiration and warning, as beautiful and merciless as the granite walls of Yosemite at dawn. Dan Osmond's tragedy begs the question, where is the line between courage and recklessness? Would you rather live a short but colorful life filled with extreme moments or a longer but more measured one? Was Osmond selfish to risk his life despite having a daughter growing up? Or could his willingness to overcome fear be considered a special form of bravery? And if you had known that the final jump would be fatal, would you have told him so? Or are some lessons humanity must learn this way, through loss and tragedy? If you like this story, don't forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episodes.